Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar. We'll go ahead and get started. Today is the final session of our 2025 Connect Plus Forum programming. Go to the next slide. As we get started with today's webinar, just a few housekeeping notes. So we are recording today's webinar. This recording will be available to view on demand after the webinar concludes on CDFI Connect and on our YouTube channel. Throughout the webinar, you can use the chat function to introduce yourselves, as some people are already doing, to share comments and interact with other attendees. And then we've allotted about 10 minutes at the end of today's webinar for audience questions. So we'll collect questions throughout the conversation as we receive them, either in the chat or in the Q&A box, and then we'll respond to them at the end during the dedicated Q&A portion. Next slide. So before we begin, I'd just like to acknowledge our sponsor for today. This webinar and all of the Connect Plus programming this year was developed with the support of our partners at the Citi Foundation, with the intention of helping to build and facilitate access to tools, skills, and expertise that will help CDFIs and other mission-driven lenders more effectively meet their mission. Next slide. So for anyone who's joining us for the first time, today's conversation is part of the 2025 Connect Plus Forum, which is OFN's annual virtual event for the industry that's specifically focused on delivering action-oriented conversations on pressing topics in members' work. So this year's theme is CDFIs and technology. So for those of you who have joined us throughout the month, we've been hosting a series of webinars and office hours that have explored the role of technology in the community development finance industry. We started with big picture emerging trends all the way down to the nuts and bolts of system implementation. And our goal throughout these sessions is for participants to leave with new perspectives and really actionable strategies to integrate tech into your work more effectively. And so we began the forum in early January with a conversation about how to build a tech-ready culture. Then we shifted to execution and focused on the how and when of technology adoption and implementation. We hosted some member office hours on cybersecurity and data privacy and on working smarter, not harder for smaller CDFIs. And then for those of you who joined us yesterday, we turned the lens specifically to AI and the evolving role that it's playing in the community development finance field. And then today, to close out our forum, today's conversation will continue to home in on the intersection between technology and mission, specifically by discussing the relationship between technology and the communities that we serve. So we know that inclusion is at the heart of what CDFIs do. Our organizations are purpose-built to expand capital access to communities that are disconnected from the financial mainstream. But we may not always be best attuned to how those principles manifest in the realm of technology. Disparities in technology access, skills, and knowledge can exacerbate financial exclusion. But on the other hand, we know that technology can also be harnessed to expand access and advance the mission. Next slide. So we're excited to bring together this great panel today to dive into these topics. And so today's speakers are Sarah Munoz, who's the Director of Growth and Expansion at Rocky Mountain Microfinance Institute, Wendy Davis, who's the Director of Marketing and Outreach at the Pennsylvania Assistive Technology Foundation, and Zaki Barzinji, who's the Senior Director at Aspen Digital at the Aspen Institute. So we'll go ahead and get the conversation started. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to just provide a brief introduction and a little bit of context about what their organization does. So Sarah, I'll start with you.
I'm Sarah Munoz. I'm Director of Growth and Expansion with Rocky Mountain Microfinance Institute. We're a Denver-based CDFI. We serve the entire state of Colorado in both English and Spanish, providing technical assistance programs, community mentorship, one-on-one coaching, and of course, capital products to support high-barrier entrepreneurs come up with an idea and launch brand new businesses, really working with folks who are in that startup mode.
Thank you. Wendy?
Hello, everybody. My name is Wendy Harkins Davis. I'm the Director of Marketing and Outreach for Pennsylvania Assistive Technology Foundation. We are based near Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, just outside Philadelphia. We are our state's designated alternative finance program for assistive technology and a CDFI. We provide financial loans for people with all disabilities, all health conditions, for the purchase of assistive technology. And we have expanded now to Kentucky, so we're also providing our loan program as a CDFI in Kentucky.
Great, thank you. And Zaki?
Hi, everybody. My name is Zaki Barzinji. I'm the Senior Director of what we call the Empowered Communities Portfolio at Aspen Digital. So my job is to lead all of the work at the Aspen Institute that focuses on the intersection of tech and systemically marginalized communities. And what that means is looking at both the impact of tech on communities and the inclusion of communities in the technology space. Some of the areas that we look at are the impact of tech on youth, well-being, and security. On the other end of the spectrum, we just finished a project on the impact of tech on older adults and their equity and the digital equity that they're seeking. And just in general, we try to take a convening approach to bring tech leaders, civil society leaders, community leaders, and policymakers together to catalyze collective action. So it's great to be with you all.
Great, thank you. I'm very excited that we have two CDFI practitioners who are working in really different contexts, and then you, Zaki, bringing that sort of broader industry perspective. So to sort of kick things off, Zaki, I'd actually turn to you first to kind of set some context and set the stage for today's conversation. So as you just talked about, your work is really at the intersection of technology and justice for marginalized communities at that national scale. So can you just talk a little bit about what it means to talk about digital equity and why these are really important considerations for CDFIs?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, digital equity is one of those phrases that sounds like a buzzword because it is. And not everybody, no two people will have exactly the same definition of what that phrase means. It's ever changing depending on the context. But one of the best sources for definitions that I like to go to is the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, NDIA. If you're not familiar with their organization, I strongly recommend you go to digitalinclusion.org and join their network of community organizations across the country. They're really kind of the gold standard of advancing digital equity. But the way that they define digital equity is a condition in which all individuals and communities have the information technology capacity needed for full participation in society, democracy, and economy. And the reason why all of those elements are important is because sometimes people have this perception that all a community needs is high-speed broadband internet, and that's enough to kind of level the playing field and bring equity to them. But when you view equity as being a more holistic thing, which again includes full participation in democracy, society, and economy, it means you need more than just connecting communities to the internet. It means also providing them with the skills necessary to understand the internet, to be able to navigate different sources of information, to be able to use digital tools to enhance their opportunities for economic prosperity and success. It's more than just connecting the community. And I think that that's an important aspect to, when we talk about serving these communities in the long term, especially from a financial perspective. It's important to look at the digital aspect of it, again, as being not just, does this community have broadband or not? In some cases, it's after the community gets connected that the real problems start, because communities are coming online for the first time are often the most susceptible to things like disinformation, financial scams in particular, of particular relevance to this group as well. So really, when we talk about digital equity, we talk about the full ecosystem and the full holistic approach to really ensuring communities have full participation in the digital world in the same way that their neighbors do, and those who have always had that kind of access.
Great, thank you. That's a really fantastic introduction, and I suspect a lot of what you just shared will really resonate with Sarah and Wendy. So maybe Sarah, I'll turn it to you. I would love to hear a little bit about what does this look like in your community and in your context? How have you experienced these challenges?
Yeah, I mean, I really agree. It's not just about creating the thing, it's about making sure approachability and usage goes along with accessibility, right? All of us in the CDFI world can relate to like creating a loan opportunity or a loan product. Just because it exists doesn't mean people know to access it, feel safe to come and access it, right? And so while it sounds strange for us, it really starts with trust. How do you build trust with community members? And especially since we're working with adults who have a lot of trauma that comes along with learning gaps and things they may not know, especially when it comes to using technology to support themselves in daily life, let alone their business. And so how do you build trust so that people feel safe coming to you and learning these new things, building these new skill sets, admitting that they have gaps in their knowledge that need to be addressed? That is like a huge first step. So Really agree. It's not just creating the thing. It's not just creating the access points, but making those access points really approachable, and using that foundation of trust to do so.
Thank you. And can you talk a little bit about where there have been specific challenges regarding like accessibility, particularly with technology in your work?
Yeah. Prior to the pandemic, we work with folks who are really, really high barrier and had a lot more comfortability working on with pen and paper than on computers. And so we used to try to run all of our programs in person. We had handwriting options for all of our technical assistance work that we requested. We pivoted like everyone else to the online world, and with that, we had to immediately build some of the accessibility elements to get our people connected. And we thought, cool. And then we quickly realized, okay, wait, we still have a whole gap here of like making sure our community can understand and access those. So one of the first things we did was that accessibility piece. How do we get folks Chromebooks? How do we get people the computer and tech they need to participate in technical assistance? How do we make sure all of the forms and learning materials we use are easy to access in the virtual world? And then how do we make sure that we are training our folks to use these tools as a part of our programming? And so we've built that in. Now we provide Chromebooks, we can provide data for folks anywhere, especially our rural community members who may struggle with Wi-Fi access. How do we get them those accessibility things they need? And then we create the process and the program to make it approachable, right? And so we start in person, we can do in-person things, we can transition it onto the laptop so people have the foundation they need to really feel comfortable using the tools we provided them.
Great, thank you. And looking forward to digging more into sort of the nuts and bolts of how you rolled out those programs as we get into the conversation. But first, Wendy, I would love to hear from you. Can you talk a little bit about how the digital divide impacts the communities that you serve, or where you see challenges of accessibility and equity most prominently?
So, we have a little bit different demographic that we're working with because everyone that we're working with has a disability or a health condition. So we have to be as accessible as possible for our clients. And unlike you, Sarah, our organization, we really never did in person. Everything has always been through a digital connection. So we have to make sure all our materials are accessible to, for example, people with low vision or blindness. So we want to make sure our guides, our applications, our FAQs, our websites, all will be read by a screen reader. Also for our deaf and hard of hearing community, we always make sure that we have ASL interpretation for our webinars. We always have open captioning. One thing that's really interesting that we've seen come up that I actually just confronted recently when I was on a bank on conversation with a collaborative group. I said, what about our deaf community? Are you offering accommodations? And they said, oh, well, we have things in print and we'll have captioning. And I've sort of felt like a heel having to say, I'm sorry, that's not enough. Our capital D deaf community, the average reading level of high school graduates who are deaf is an elementary school level of reading, 4th grade. And 30% of our deaf students graduate as functionally illiterate. So ASL is their first language. English is a second language. So not providing information in ASL creates a barrier. They don't have the same access to materials. They don't understand necessarily as well without having that ASL interpretation. So, everything we do, we're looking at accessibility. I never say that we're 100% accessible because that's not really necessarily possible. For our deaf blind communities, it's very challenging to do anything over digital. That we really need to do in person with tactile interpreters. So anybody who wants information about different resources that are out there to help make your materials website accessible, we'd be happy to share.
Thank you. So before we dig in deeper into sort of some of these strategies that you've implemented, I would actually love to turn it back to you, Zaki, and just ask big picture, are there any guiding values or principles that organizations should be keeping in mind regarding how technology is impacting their communities?
Yeah, look, I mean, the one overarching principle that I think both Sarah and Wendy, touched on is the community itself that you are serving needs to be centered in everything that you do, from the early stages of design all the way through to implementation and feedback. and the community that's most affected in your work needs to be a partner in co-designing and co-developing any solution that comes out of it. So that's the overarching value. Now, more specifically, we talk about digital equity often as being the goal. We want to achieve digital equity, and we'll never really achieve it, but we always need to be working towards it. The digital divide is the challenge that we're trying to overcome. And by overcoming the digital divide, we will achieve digital equity or come closer to digital equity. And then the actual work to do that is often what we call digital inclusion. And digital inclusion is again, these are all buzzwordsies, and it can all kind of be all over the place, but digital inclusion is like the active things that we must do in order to bridge the divide to reach equity. And generally, the general principles of what digital inclusion includes is, like we already talked about, robust broadband internet service, right? Making sure that the community that you're engaging must have high-speed broadband internet service. And high speed is a very specifically defined thing, and it's important to make sure that it is high speed. Devices, access to devices that meet the needs of the user is a really big part of ensuring digital equity. Digital literacy training, again, is another big thing, a big element of achieving digital equity, because it's not enough that you have the internet, it's not enough that you have a device, you also have to have the hands-on training to be able to use that device on the internet. Technical support for when things go wrong is another major element and principle behind an overall digital inclusion approach to digital equity. And the last thing is, content and products and applications that are specifically designed with the community that's being served in mind. And that is also an important element to all of this, because it's not enough to have the connection and to have the training to enable the use of that technology. You also have to make sure that there is content that's being created that actually serves the community that you're dealing with. So I would say those 5 principles are how we kind of define digital inclusion as an area of work generally, and then obviously the specifics of what your organization does, what the community's needs are, that's where things kind of change. But as long as you keep those overall principles in mind, then hopefully you're working in service of digital equity.
Great, and thank you so much for parsing out some of those definitions for us a little bit, because I think it can feel a little opaque or a little bit overwhelming that this is sort of a field that if you're unfamiliar with, like not knowing where to start. So really helpful to understand how those pieces fit together. And I think with this group, we actually have already touched a little bit on sort of the holistic, how holistic of an effort this is, with Sarah talking about both the hardware and the skills, Wendy talking about the sort of accessibility of the actual content that's being delivered. So I think we'll continue to sort of dig into that, but it's really helpful to see how we're talking across this sort of how all of the landscape of inclusion efforts sort of fit together into a whole. Is Wendy or Sarah, anything else on principles or sort of guiding values that you would want to add or respond to?
I mean, I started with trust. I think trust is really important in this. That is our first principle in our organization. And as we look to engage with our communities in any new way, don't go straight to the thing, go straight to building trust. The things will come.
Yeah, and I would like to add, we always say we recommend you open that door. What type of accommodations do you need? What can we do so that we can better connect with you? But I should also point out that on average, it takes 7 years for people to acknowledge that they have hearing loss. 7 years of being somewhat disconnected from their community, from loved ones, not understanding what's being given to them. So there's also people with auditory processing disorder, and especially people in their 40s and 50s, that wasn't even a recognized or accepted medical diagnosis just 10 years ago. And all these things like captioning benefits all those people, and they would probably never think to ask for it. Many people don't want to acknowledge that they have a disability. I've had people go out of their way to hide that they have a disability. So automatically providing that helps you connect with your clients.
Thank you. That's a really staggering data point and yeah, a great point to raise. So let's dig in a little bit to some of these strategies that you have all started talking about a little bit. So Sarah, maybe I'll start with you. Can you talk us through how your organization is ensuring that technology is accessible to all of your borrowers and clients, maybe from how you sort of identified that there was an issue to then how you implemented a solution?
Yeah. The issues were really quick to identify during the pandemic. Like I said, we were operating in an in-person world and we had to shift ourselves and bring our entrepreneurs with us and our whole tactics into this virtual space. And so, some of the things we really realized as a starting point is that our outreach team still largely remains in person and starting with people to people connections. A lot of our intake processes, very early learning needed to be usable on a cell phone, right? So we haven't provided equipment yet. People have phones. It's usually their biggest connection to think, so do our surveys, does our intake forms, does everything really work well? And is it easy to manage on the things people already have? And so that was a big learning. Also sending everything through text message rather than email as a starting point, right? Our community members aren't used to they're not addicted to the email like I am. So many folks are going through the text messages, those kinds of little shifts. And I like the language Zach was using around like it was centric of the community we're working with, acknowledging what they were already comfortable with as our starting point for engagement, building that trust. And then over time, we slowly transition more and more and more into the digital space. And so by the time you get into our first program, we're providing the computer access if you need it. And in our rural communities, we often have tried to accommodate, especially as a brand new program, if we're entering a brand new area, is there a way we can offer it hybrid so that those who still feel most comfortable can get that in-person support? So we've worked in a lot of formations with our program, our cohort models of like hybrid, virtual, in-person, whatever works to kind of get the first program rolling. And then after that, we use all free Google Suites, right? Those are free to everybody. Everyone has access to those tools. And we train our entrepreneurs in how to access and use them throughout the program. And so it starts small with like filling out forms. And then by the time our boot camp's over, they have P&Ls in spreadsheets that they're able to use to underwrite loans. But it's a step-by-step process to bring it in. Our work with the Spanish language and Spanish speaking community and rural communities have really showed the even greater divide. We also had a huge investment over the last few years in our formerly incarcerated communities who are coming out with a big technology gap and needing to make up efforts. And so we've really worked through how do we do some of our workshops when we can in person, especially if they have a technology component. And when they have to be virtual, how do we incorporate one-on-one mentorship to support more of that work? And when they're bilingual, can we bring in partners that help us really achieve some of those technology pieces that we wouldn't be able to, like live translation, and just opening up who can attend our info sessions and then opening up who can attend our events. So those have been some of the easier adaptations we've been able to pull in to kind of open up accessibility, but kind of the approachability piece has been built into the program. And, as the trust builds, so does the kind of expectation with what technology use looks like in our programming.
Thank you. Wendy, what about you? Would you like to either share some examples or elaborate on some of the examples that you've shared already about how your organization is using technology to expand accessibility?
So we really rely on our clients telling us what they need. So a little about me, my husband and I have 2 children who were born with hearing loss. So our involvement with advocacy for the deaf and hard of hearing community started a long, long time ago. So you learn along the way if you have clients who are, and I say capital D deaf, that's our traditional deaf community. ASL is their first language. They typically don't voice. But then we have our lowercase d community, which they may use a little bit of sign language, but they also speak. They're pretty proficient in English. And we have found that many of them, they need to see your lips. They're reading your lips. So their preferred communication may be texting. But they also may ask you to FaceTime because they want to see your face and read your lips, because that's something they're more comfortable with. It's faster than trying to read something. So we really try to respond to what people request. What are their needs? What are their preferred methods for communication? That sort of thing, I guess.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Zaki, I would put it to you as well. Do you have an example or two that you could share from organizations that you've seen that are doing this really effectively?
Yeah, I'll just quickly shout out a project that we worked on called kidsareonline.org. It's a project that we at Aspen launched that focuses specifically on community stories from around the country of different communities that close the digital divide for young people in particular. And actually, it's open submissions. So if any of your communities have case studies that you'd like us to highlight, please get in contact and fill it out. There's one specific, I mean, there's a bunch of really cool examples on that website, but one in particular is the story of a North Carolina-based nonprofit that was focused on, helping kids, middle school students in particular from underserved communities, learn the basics of STEM, of science, technology, engineering, arts, and math, to kind of close the skills gap, the technology skills gap in the community. And they did that primarily as an after-school program in schools. But then when the pandemic hit, they had to figure out, how are we going to be able to continue to provide these services? We can't do it remote because a lot of these kids don't have access to the internet. They're not going into school because schools are closed. So they worked with the community to develop a solution, and the solution was to buy several buses and convert those buses into mobile workshops that had internet connectivity and the technology and the teachers that could provide training, and they would drive these buses into communities that needed those resources. And it solved all of the problems that we talked about under the digital inclusion umbrella. It solved the connectivity issues. It solved the access, the devices, and the training needed. So that was a really cool example of innovation in a time of crisis, and innovation in a time of crisis in coordination with the community itself. One other thing I'll quickly mention is another project that we have is our product equity working group at Aspen, where we work with tech companies to kind of rethink the way they build products, to make it more equitable and more inclusive. And one really good example is Uber recently went through a really intensive process of changing their app to make it more accessible and usable for people who are blind or hard of hearing. And they created these new features that include self-identification. If you are somebody who has a service animal, or you're somebody who identifies as being hard of hearing or blind, it would allow you to then to self-identify on the app. And this has been a big change in the way the app used to work. And a big part of it was somebody on the product team was themselves had low vision ability, and was able to bring in advocates from the community to work with them to refine the app and to find the best solution, which was self-identification. So those are two examples, and plenty more, abound.
Great, thank you. It's really interesting, I think, to be having this conversation at the close of this Connect Plus forum. As we've been talking all month about technology, a lot of our conversations have focused on how CDFIs are using technology internally to increase efficiency, automation, all of these things. And so I think it's really apt that we're sort of closing this conversation then with how technology is impacting the communities externally, because in a lot of these examples that you're sharing, the introduction of the technology is actually the first step. And then there's a lot more work along the way to make sure that it's actually able to be used and is having the impact that you want it to have. That's sort of something I'm hearing throughout these examples. And so this is sort of a question to anyone if it resonates, but have you ever encountered a new accessibility or equity issue that has come about as a result of releasing a new technology? So maybe you use a new technology intervention, and then you sort of discover that there have been, that you've now sort of created new accessibility issues. And then how did you mitigate that, if so?
I mean, I think it's hard when we roll out new technology, or I mean, I guess we're not really rolling out elaborate technology. So, ours, it's not necessarily, we know the impact is coming, I think, mainly because I think people have a fear instinct that comes up every time we kind of raise the expectation on what we want people to deliver. So using a new software, or, okay, we're going to roll out a new form system and it's going to be automated and people will be able, and there's a little bit of hesitancy and fear behind it. So I do say, like, while the intention is to speed things up, slowing it down really does help everyone involved. And something I really liked that Zaki said was about the Uber example was somebody in the room, right, who is part of that community. In general, I think you are better to address these issues when you are addressing them from the community first, not from the organization. So, you know, how do you get them involved in what they need to support it? One of the things we've really thought about with our Spanish language community is our financial workbook. It's basic financial projections. That's always hard. Numbers are scary. Technology is scary. There's a lot of like fear around how to use it, how to adapt to the tools. So we've tested out doing that one workshop while the rest of the program might be virtual with mentors in person, right? That was for the Spanish language community more than ever. And of course, now we're like, well, should this be an option for all of our programs? Because I think a theme with all of what we're saying, and something Wendy was touching on too, is like, if you create these accessibility pathways for those who have the highest barriers, who have the biggest obstacles to overcome when feeling comfortable using them, you are creating a system that's going to be more approachable for everyone, right? When you make things more accessible, when Zoom has better sound options, live translation, whatever it is, when it's more accessible, everyone does better in the situation. So I think it's really important to like bring the community in to have those conversations. Start with those who you think might have the highest barriers and recognize that everyone can probably benefit from whatever system you create.
That's such a great point. Thank you. Zaki, is that something that you've seen in your work as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it goes back to, we often say that solving for the most marginalized improves the experience for everybody. Because, if you're fixing something for the edge case, it means you're making a better overall product or service that actually helps everybody. One specific example, I think you guys have already had sessions on AI, but one trend that we saw come up with older adults and digital equity in particular is being careful about what data you're using to train your new applications. There are now a lot of instances of older adults who are interacting with AI-driven apps that are trained on populations that are actually much younger. What it often leads to is misdiagnoses of older adults, and in even worse cases, denial of insurance benefits for older adults, because the data that the model is trained on is saying that, oh, these people don't qualify based on their profile, they should not qualify for insurance coverage, or they shouldn't qualify, or their diagnosis is something else that it's not. And that's all because that population, the older adult population, is not represented in the data that these new applications are being trained on. So a very important overall principle is to always ensure that whatever your application is, whatever work you're doing, that the data itself is representative of all communities and is not overly skewed towards one population over another.
Great, thank you for highlighting that point. So stepping back a little bit from the sort of specific examples and thinking more broadly about kind of implementation overall, this is a question for anybody. What are some of the practical sort of steps or questions that you think practitioners could be asking themselves along the way to ensure that they're really putting equity at the center of how they use technology? And maybe Sarah, I would put it to you first.
Yeah, I mean, for us, we really, our whole program model is entrepreneur centric. So for us, it's one of the first questions is like, what is our community already doing? That's where we kind of start. How do we understand the landscape we're in? What is our community already doing? And then for us internally, how do we get them to engage with us to understand what their needs are better and build a system with them that's going to make the programming and the tech more accessible? And an example of this for us is AI, because a lot of folks are exploring AI underwriting. We are not in that place. Capital coaching and one-on-one touch in the capital phase is something that we are still really ingrained in, our community really needs. I mean, our first loan product is $3,500. We're working with folks who are in a very large capital barrier and are going to be with us in technical assistance for 6 months at least before they probably access that loan. And so for us, it's the human touch that's really needed at that phase. So because we started from an entrepreneur-centric spot, we understand that technology piece might not be right for us, but what is, and what can still create operational efficiency for us internally and our entrepreneurs, and how do we find those tech pieces? And so we do that by asking our community, working with our community, understanding their needs, and only adding and adapting where it really benefits them first. And then we kind of grow it from there.
Great, thank you. And Wendy, I'm glad you were able to join us again. It's only fitting that in a conversation about the pitfalls of technology that we would have technology issues. So thank you for
And
checking
that
that for us.
never happens. Yeah. We're in the
Um,
suburb, so but it is windy today, so maybe we're getting some issues due to the wind. But if you could rephrase the question, I sort of missed the
Sure.
intro.
Absolutely. So are there any sort of practical questions that you think that practitioners should keep in mind when thinking about accessibility in tech?
Oh, well, I'm constantly repeating myself, but just there's a saying in the disability community, nothing for us without us. So really relying on that community, for us anyway, for people with disabilities, for them to tell us what they need. And one of the things that we address that is how we internally built our organization with the people. We have 60%, over 60% of our employees and board are individuals with disabilities or have immediate family members with disabilities. So having that lived experience helps us to be able to respond to the needs of our communities that we're working with. And the technology, it's always changing, right, Sarah and Zaki? There's always something new coming out. We are exploring AI. We are building a focus group to help us in implementing AI, to help us with online chat. And we're involving people from who have different disabilities and different age groups. Our son, Clark, who has the severe to profound hearing loss, he's a biomedical engineering major. He's in his 20s. He's coming in to help us, represent people with hearing loss, also a younger age group, versus we have some people who are older with low vision blindness. So they represent a different demographic, different challenges for figuring how does AI work with this audience.
Great. And then lastly, Zaki, or Sarah, did you have something you wanted to add
Yeah,
on
so
that?
I was going to add, one of the things we noticed, and this might be too technical a question, but one of the things I do really ask myself when we're thinking about these kind of digital interventions is, can I teach someone how to use it if I'm on their cell phone looking at their laptop? And if it's more complicated than that, we probably can't do it in the starting phases of where we're at. We're going to have to really work for a while to get to a place. But that question really reminds me of the gap we're trying to bridge. And, one of the key components of our programming is volunteers, mentors. We recruit mentors from anywhere. If any of you want to volunteer, check it out at our website. But we recruit volunteers from anywhere. We have them all over the state of Colorado for our programs. The meetings have to be virtual. And so for our volunteers, we also have to train them to be equipped to work in the space with our community members and understand that the digital equity divide. We do offer DEIA trainings for our volunteer community. We do pre-program trainings. And one of the things we specifically address is how do we support the digital gap that exists between our entrepreneurs who need to function in the space and our mentors who maybe work for banks and are really equipped with it and go through it really quickly. So it hasn't just been about educating one community group. It's about really educating the entire community that's interacting with RMMFI so that anyone our entrepreneurs engage with are getting the same level of understanding and support from whoever's on the team.
That's a great barometer that whether you can explain it that way, because I think it also is a good reminder, as you're saying, these things don't necessarily have to be high tech. We're not necessarily talking about really high tech solutions. We're talking about solutions that you're able to sort of bring everybody into the fold to use effectively. Zaki, anything you want to add on any of that? Any common pitfalls or questions that would be helpful?
I would just quickly jump off of what Sarah mentioned about the importance of mentors and volunteers and folks who can act as bridges. There is the emerging concept of digital navigators, which is modeled after the healthcare navigators. That was a very crucial component of rolling out the Affordable Care Act. Over, I guess it's been over like a decade ago, or almost a decade ago. The idea of a digital navigator is somebody who understands both the community and the community's needs, and also understands technology and the technology solutions that are available to help serve those communities' needs. There's federal funding available to create more digital navigators in more communities across the country. And it's a really good way to focus on building capacity for people who can serve as a trusted bridge, going back to Sarah's other point, somebody who's from the community, who can build trust, but who also knows the tech landscape and the innovation landscape, which is obviously progressing at breakneck pace. So investing in digital navigators in particular is a really important action that anybody can take and should take, regardless of your focus of work, because it means that you're building a network of experts who can uniquely bridge the divide. So that would be my other specific tip there.
That's actually a great segue too to the next thing that I wanted to ask you all about, which was resourcing. So Wendy, maybe I would start with you. Is there anything you can share about how you've really cultivated the resources that you need to implement some of these strategies that you've talked about?
Sure. So, for our websites, because we actually have 3 websites that we maintain. We are working with website designers who are well versed in accessibility, so we're able to build that into our websites. We have trusted organizations that we work with. If you're familiar with 508 compliant, are you all familiar with 508 compliant? That makes documents accessible. They're tagged in the background, works well for screen readers. So we have an organization that we work with almost exclusively to do work like that for us. We have different organizations that we work with for our ASL interpreters, which is great because we need them for board meetings, we need them for webinars, we need them for quite a few things. And then we have partnerships, collaborations with different organizations that we're able to share ideas. And, when we're working on events and things like that, everyone's bringing their expertise to the table to make sure that we have addressed the different accessibility needs of our audiences. And I want to make sure that I share that besides people with disabilities, we always have all of our materials available in Spanish. When we do webinars, we have a Spanish language channel. I would like to go further than that, but it's really hard to figure out. In Philadelphia, there's Philadelphia alone, there are so many diverse populations. And even if I start talking about, well, I want to do some work with our Penn Asian Senior Center, they're supporting so many different languages. We do have that availability on our website. We can support multiple languages, but when it comes to developing materials, that is very challenging to decide where to go next. But so we have the double-edged sword. We're addressing accessibility for people with disabilities, but also language barriers. It gets to be a lot of balls in the air.
Yeah, and I'm sure a lot of having to decide and prioritize, how you spend limited time and resources. And so, Sarah, same question to you. Anything you would share about how you resource this work?
I mean, we always, to Wendy's point, accessibility in for folks who have disabilities, who have visual, hearing issues, we're always trying to figure out ways that we can better address them, right? And we try to leverage partnerships as much as we can to make that happen. We feel the money crunch like everyone else, right? Like all of us nonprofits, we don't have extras. We can't just build and build and build. And so we've really found the power of partnerships to be super beneficial. We work with a language co-op, and they have their mission is to make language accessibility happen. So they have friendlier rates, especially for their nonprofit partners. So we really work with them on a local level. We want to partner with community organizations that already have the trust and likely already have interventions built into how they're operating and working with their communities. And so, we don't want to recreate a wheel. If there's somebody who's doing it and they do it well, how do we just work with them? And we wanted to do the same back. Now in our next year, we are launching a way to license our programming models. And so one of the things we found is like, hey, if there's a group in a deaf community that want to start businesses and we don't have the interventions built in to run our programs for them, can we just make our programs available to that organization to use with their community in their programming, how they're already functioning in a way that already meets the needs of the community members they're working with? And we found, like, this works for refugee communities. They understand the unique technology barriers that some of our refugee communities, especially from certain areas, have different barriers than for others. They have the understanding of what their community needs. They often have the interventions built. Can we just make our programs accessible to them so that they can do it and deliver it in a way that already meets their community needs? Maybe the solution isn't us all the time. So we're really like living in the partnership space and trying to find, as we've all mentioned, what works for the person we're trying to serve and putting them at the center and recognizing that might be a partner and not us.
Zaki, what about from your vantage point? Do you have any advice or suggestions for how organizations can really sustain this commitment to digital inclusion and digital equity work moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it's been said already, and I think keeping the holistic approach to digital equity, understanding that it's a journey, it's not a destination, it's not a switch that can be flipped, is very important. I think looking at both short-term solutions and also long-term resilience is a really important balance to strike. One thing that we saw in the pandemic, again, was there was a lot of, like I said, innovation in a time of crisis, where a lot of really bold new things were happening out of necessity to better connect with folks. And then the worry, though, coming the further we get out of the pandemic, is that things are snapping back to the status quo pre-pandemic, where there was less appetite for risk, less appetite to work with communities and to move fast to solve problems and issues. And so that's the ongoing challenge: is how do you retain the same attitude of going above and beyond and finding creative solutions to helping the communities in need? How do you kind of institutionalize that appetite? So it's not just during a time of crisis, is a very important question to ask, no matter who you are or what community you're serving. Yeah, and I think beyond that, I would say also diversifying funding is always important for projects, whether there's, as all of you are probably more painfully well aware than I am, in just the last like 24 hours, we heard that all federal funding was frozen, and then all of a sudden it got all unfrozen. And now there's a big question mark about what's going to happen in the future. And I'm sure all of you are affected by that in multiple ways. It's just a good reminder that the sustainability aspect of this depends on diversification of where the support's coming from. And that's just a really important general principle, I think, to keep in mind as you move forward in this work.
Yes, these as we were talking about earlier, these challenges are not new. The digital divide and these challenges of digital inequity have been with us for a long time, but it certainly has continued, is evolving quickly and continues to evolve. And so, kind of on that theme of these things not being a switch, there's no kind of binary endpoint. How do you think about evaluating the success of some of your digital inclusion efforts? Sarah or Wendy, how do you think about evaluating?
I mean, for us, it's entrepreneur engagement. We do, we have tons of pre and post surveys for every program we run. And so that's where we get feedback when it comes to our, regular connections with the community and graduations in person to hear how things work for them. But we do address it directly in our pre and our post survey around what worked in the program, what didn't, what suggestions do you want? And that's where we get our biggest piece. For us, it's really, are they able to engage? If they can't get in the door, we've that's the sign. We're already starting with interventions that are too high. They can't access that point. We saw a big drop off between our first and second program phases. How do we engage there? So that's really what we look at, is like where we look at our entrepreneur engagement. We work with our folks, for a really long time. So when we see that drop off, we kind of start to analyze what it is. And often we found, is it accessible is the question, whether that be a language accessibility issue, whether that be literally tuning in or connections, or they're rural, they can't get to the place where the thing is. How do we kind of create those opportunities for everyone? And we see that in kind of our feedback forms, just regular engagement with the community on those issues.
Thank you. Wendy, anything you would add to that?
Yeah, I mean, very much the same. We have we have very vocal audiences, so they will tell us when something is not accessible and where we have to make improvements. But then we also rely a lot on our partners. I will, we'll go to and share something and say, does this work for you? Does this look right to you? And we're not trying to be the experts on all of this. So we do rely on other organizations to help double check what we're doing. Are we on the right track? Are we doing the right thing? Are we headed in the right direction? And we all have frequently used task force and focus groups to help us, channel or pave that path, direct us. Where do we need to go? What should we be doing next? Where are you seeing the challenges in your community? What do we need to do in order to make our products and make our organization more accessible and trustworthy, right? Sarah, you talked a lot about that trust. One of the things that we did was a PR campaign to really promote disability recognition or, the disability representation within our organization, because that begins that sense of trust. Okay, these people know what I'm talking about. People are less hesitant to ask for what they need for accessibility, or for even identifying what they need for assistive technology, because yeah, we get it. We have people who've been there, they know it, they live it every day. We walk in that world. So a lot of it is partners, the community, and just opening that door to make sure there is a two-way open communication.
Yeah, I keep forgetting to think about our volunteers, but one thing I will add is that our core boot camp program, each entrepreneur gets a one to 3 person mentor team depending on needs. So we often have double the volunteers working with us as entrepreneurs in our boot camp programs. And to the point of sometimes your community doesn't know what it doesn't know. Often the volunteers who are experts in the field do. And so we also survey our volunteers. We both have pre and post program surveys, but also annual surveys where we just ask them to give us feedback in general. What interventions do they need? What are they struggling with when supporting our entrepreneurs? Those are the things happening outside of kind of our sterile classroom environment where they're getting that one-on-one business application. And so they might know what our entrepreneurs aren't connecting with, what they're not seeing, what they're not able to execute that our entrepreneurs might not because they aren't aware yet. So we really do look to our partners and our volunteer community as well to help inform, hey, this is the gap. How can we bridge it?
Great, thank you so much. So I have one more question for you all, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A from the audience. So if anybody has questions, feel free now to put them in the chat or in the Q&A box. But in sort of a closing question to look ahead a little bit and maybe end on an optimistic note, if resources weren't a constraint, where do you think that technology could have the most impact in your work? Or where and how would you like to be using technology in your sort of ideal world, given no resource limitations? Zaki, maybe I would start with you. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. If resources were not a limit, I mean, look, my work has always been about eliminating barriers to equity. And I think to the extent that technology can be used to level the playing field, from communities who traditionally and systemically have not had access to resources, to proper education, to healthcare, anything that can be done from a technology standpoint to level that playing field is to me a major win. And there's a lot of caveats to that because while AI is exciting and advancing every day, there's also this tremendous potential to further codify traditional biases and tools of marginalization. And so my hope would be that with unlimited resources, we could make technology that is truly designed by and serves all, in a way that enhances people's lives, allows them to have full digital lives where they can express themselves and connect to others that they relate to, and are able to have full participation in society. So that's, I mean, that's a very like, lofty, like kind of world peace type answer, but that's what it is. That's what the vision is. If we have unlimited resources, we should be working towards equity for all and using technology as an enabler for that.
Thank you. That is a great aspiration. Wendy, what about you? How would you like to be using tech in your work if resources were unlimited?
Yeah, I actually have a project that I want to do so badly that we need to get funding to do it. I want to go back and update all of our old video. We have videos demonstrating how people use assistive technology, which is so impactful. People really don't understand how people with severe physical disabilities can live independently with the use of assistive technology, especially smart home technology. But we don't have audio descriptions or visual, the visual descriptions. And that's something that we want to go back and do, but it's costly to go back and update all those videos with those descriptions so that our blind and low vision communities have equal access to those videos. And we think we've covered everything until we trip on something. I did a presentation for graduate students in low vision and blindness studies, and 6 of the students were blind, and I'm showing a video with music and like, okay, I'm going to do audio descriptions right here on the fly. So, it's one of those things that it's expensive, and we're a nonprofit. So finding the funding to do those types of projects, we're waiting.
Thank you. And I love the balance of a really big, bold aspiration and a really specific and practical project, because I think it's all of the above, I'm sure. Sarah, turn it to you.
I mean, +1 to everything they said, right? If I really do believe in Zaki's, world peace if we can through digital equity. I think the hardest part is recognizing we're downstream from some of the problems that really impact one of our greatest resources, which is our capacity of the people we're working with to learn all these things, right? You can't throw it all at the table at one time. And, it means being downstream from people who have food equity issues. And there are technology solutions that can be applied in all of these places that can create the capacity people need to really be able to support themselves and their passion in the work through entrepreneurship. And so I think recognizing that digital equity has to happen beyond just our organizations. We have to advocate for it in all systems of life, because the more capacity we can create for the community we're working with, the more time they will have to invest in these learning opportunities and with our organizations.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. We have one question from the audience, one quick question, and that is, how should digital inclusion be governed, and who will decide community priorities? And I think, Wendy, you actually started talking about this a little bit in the conversation with like the task forces and the community groups that you use, but just if anybody has a quick thought on who will decide community priorities and how should digital inclusion be governed?
So for us, we're making everything accessible to all people with all different disabilities. So we're really, there is no priority. Everybody has equal priority when it comes to making our materials accessible. I know, Sarah, how do you face that?
I mean, it's so hard, right? Who wants to, talk about things that are hard to prioritize. You want everyone to have it, right? The best we can do is we focus in on who is our mission. Where is our mission? How do we make sure we're adhering to the community we've agreed to serve and go to them for what they need, right? Like, we are here for the entrepreneurs. We are here to help activate their possible. We need to go to them for our direction. We just created our strategic plan. We did focus groups with our entrepreneurs. We did phone calls with our volunteers. We did everything we could to start our ideations with them. And that's the best guidance we can get. Outside of that, how do we partner? That's our biggest mindset. So we try to get to our community to tell us where they want us to go.
And I'd like to add, we have a brand book that was developed 4 or 5 years ago. And in that brand book, it defines that we need to make everything as accessible as we can. And sometimes that sounds really intimidating, like, oh gosh, that's going to be super expensive. Some of the stuff is, but some of it is not. right? Making documents 508 compliant, making a flyer 508 compliant, for example, PDF, $28, I think was the last one that we had done. So not expensive, not a long turnaround time, not a huge investment, but huge for your visually impaired community. ASL and captioning, not really that expensive. And we videotape all of our webinars and we put that on our website. So that creates new content for us. So that's really an investment in building, content that we share with our community. It's not just a one shot. Yeah, we just showed it one night. It's lives out there for people to go and see. So, I really encourage you to look at really what does it cost to make things accessible? And it's really not probably as bad as you're thinking.
I think that's an excellent note to end on. That note of inspiration that these things, we talked about the big picture, but also these things can start small, and those sort of small actions can have a really big impact. So we are right at, or if not a minute over time. And so I just want to thank each of you again so much for taking the time out today to really share your insights. This was such a rich conversation, and really appreciate you all sharing your expertise on this. And thank you all to all of the attendees today, and for everyone who's joined us throughout the Connect Plus Forum this month. As I said, this was our last session of the 2025 Connect Plus Forum. And so this recording and all of the recordings will be up on CDFI Connect and on our YouTube channel. And keep an eye out in the follow-up to the forum, because we're going to be sharing a series of new resources on technology that will be coming out as part of the follow-up to this event. So with that, I'll just say one more thank you to everyone for joining us today, and hope everybody has a good rest of the week.
Thank you. Thank you so much.